You look like a foundry worker, not my Duchess, the Duke said before the entire courtyard. Change your clothes, or stay behind. Lady Clara Ashbourne felt every servant near the stables lower their eyes. No one wished to witness the Duke of Blackmere humiliating his wife, but no one dared move far enough away to miss it either. Clara remained beside her stallion, tightening the leather strap that secured a brass mechanism inside her saddlebag. She wore a dark green riding coat over fitted breeches, tall boots marked with soot, and gloves bearing faint traces of machine oil. Her chestnut hair had been pinned securely, rather than arranged beneath the feathered bonnet waiting in her chamber. She was dressed for work, not admiration. Her husband stood several paces behind her in a perfectly tailored charcoal coat. At 34, Adrian Ashbourne possessed the broad shoulders, restrained expression, and effortless authority expected of a duke whose family had controlled the Blackmere ironworks for 3 generations. That morning, however, his composure was strained by the sight of the blue silk gown draped across the arms of Clara's maid. Lord Pembroke will arrive at the Stonebridge exhibition before 10, Adrian continued. He is considering an investment large enough to rescue this estate from 20 years of declining orders. I will not greet him with a wife who appears ready to shovel coal. He is visiting because he needs a more efficient furnace, Clara replied. He is not travelling 200 miles to inspect my sleeves. He expects to meet the Duchess of Blackmere, and he will, not dressed like that. Clara's fingers paused over the saddle strap. 17 months of disappointment pressed against the calm she had entered their arranged marriage knowing affection might never grow between them. She had accepted that. What she had not expected was to become invisible inside a house that desperately needed everything she knew. Her late father had been one of England's finest mechanical engineers. While other girls practiced embroidery, Clara had learned to calculate furnace pressure and recognize a failing gear by the rhythm of its vibration. After his death, his workshop, she had brought those notebooks to Blackmere. For nearly a year, she had studied the estate's furnaces in secret, compared their waste against her father's calculations, and built a compact regulator capable of reducing coal consumption without lowering heat. The model now resting in her saddlebag could save the ironworks. Adrian had never asked why she returned from the foundry after midnight. He had only complained about the soot on her cuffs. The blue silk is appropriate, he said, gesturing toward the gown. You have 15 minutes. Clara looked at the dress. Pearls had been sewn around its neckline, and silver thread shimmered through its elaborate skirts. It was beautiful, expensive, and entirely useless in a machinery pavilion. Then she looked at her husband. 17 months ago, I entered this house wearing silk, she said quietly. It did not persuade you to listen to me then. I see no reason to believe it will persuade anyone else today. A flicker of discomfort crossed Adrian's face, but pride hardened it almost immediately. This is not a debate about your intelligence. No, it is a command concerning my appearance, because you would prefer Lord Pembroke to see an obedient wife rather than a capable one. I would prefer him to see that Blackmere remains a dignified and orderly house. If one woman's boots can destroy its dignity, Your Grace, then perhaps the house is not as strong as you imagine. The stable yard fell painfully silent. Adrian stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do not challenge me before the servants, then do not diminish me before them. For one suspended moment, anger and something more uncertain moved through his eyes. He could have asked what she carried in the saddlebag. He could have questioned why she had worked until dawn, or why the foundry master had quietly granted her access to the abandoned Eastern workshop. Instead, he made the choice that would change their marriage. If you ride through those gates dressed in that manner, he said, you will attend without my protection. I will not defend you when every gentleman in Stonebridge laughs. The words struck deeper than Clara allowed him to see. She had never expected tenderness from Adrian, but some guarded part of her had believed that if the moment truly mattered, her husband would stand beside her. Now she understood that he would stand beside her only while she remained smaller than he was. Clara fastened the final buckle. Then I shall give them something more interesting to discuss than my clothes. She placed one boot in the stirrup and mounted her stallion in a single practiced movement. Clara. She gathered the reins. The carriage road is flooded near Westmore, she said. You will lose at least 20 minutes if your driver follows it. Take the northern ridge. How would you know that? Because unlike the men who advise you, I visited the coal depot yesterday. Before he could respond, she guided the stallion through the courtyard gates. Behind her, Adrian called her name again, but she did not turn. The brass mechanism moved gently inside the saddlebag as the horse accelerated along the ridge road. Clara reached Stonebridge well before the ducal carriage. The exhibition grounds occupied 3 enormous halls beside the river, their high glass windows already veiled by smoke from demonstration furnaces. Merchants, engineers, investors, and landowners filled the central pavilion. Decorative gates and polished iron ornaments stood beneath Blackmere's banner, carefully arranged to create the appearance of prosperity. Clara knew the truth hidden behind that display. The estate's largest furnace consumed nearly twice the coal it should. Several clients had quietly transferred their orders to newer foundries. Without Lord Pembroke's contract, Blackmere would begin dismissing workers before winter. By spring, creditors might force Adrian to close the eastern works entirely. A steward hurried toward her as she entered. "Your Grace, the receiving party is gathering in the Grand Hall. I will join them shortly. The Duke instructed us to escort you there immediately. My husband is not here." The steward hesitated. Clara removed the saddlebag from her shoulder and walked toward the machinery pavilion. At an empty work table, she unpacked the model, a miniature furnace no larger than a sewing chest, fitted with copper pipes, a pressure gauge, and the regulator she had constructed from her father's final drawings. Several engineers glanced toward her, initially amused by the sight of a Duchess handling tools. Their amusement faded when she ignited the burner. The miniature bellows began moving without assistance. The needle on the gauge climbed steadily, then stopped at the precise pressure Clara had marked. Heat passed through the chamber, while the coal feed reduced itself automatically. An elderly engineer stepped closer. "What controls the intake?" "A counterweighted valve connected to the pressure chamber," Clara answered. "As the heat rises, the valve narrows the coal feed before the furnace begins wasting fuel. That would require extraordinary calibration." It required 8 months. More men gathered around the table. Questions came quickly, and Clara answered each one without hesitation. For the first time since her marriage, no one spoke over her. No one redirected the question toward her husband. They watched her hands, listened to her explanations, and judged her by what she had built. Then the crowd parted. Lord Pembroke stood at its edge. He was a lean, silver-haired industrialist whose investments stretched from Bristol to Liverpool. Beside him stood Adrian, breathless from his delayed journey and rigid with disbelief. Pembroke approached the model. "Who designed this?" Clara looked at her husband. Adrian had an opportunity to step forward, acknowledge her work, and introduce her as his equal. He said nothing. "My father developed the original principle," Clara answered. "I redesigned the pressure chamber and built the regulator." Pembroke studied the steady gauge. "Can it be enlarged for a commercial furnace?" "Yes, although the intake ratio must be adjusted according to the chamber's volume." "Could you adapt it for my Bristol works?" "With access to its measurements, I could complete the design within 4 weeks." Pembroke straightened and extended his hand. "Then, Duchess, I believe you are the reason I came to Stonebridge." Around them, whispers spread through the pavilion. Adrian's face remained composed, but Clara saw humiliation gathering behind his eyes. He had feared her clothing would embarrass him. Instead, it was her undeniable competence that had left him standing uselessly beside her. Pembroke requested a private meeting that afternoon. Before leaving, however, he examined the furnace model once more. "You will require considerable coal reserves to fulfill an order of this size. Blackmere has contracts with 3 northern pits," Adrian said, finally recovering his voice. "Our supply is secure." Clara noticed a man standing behind Pembroke glanced down when Adrian spoke. He wore the grey coat of a Stonebridge freight agent, and a black iron token hung from his watch chain, the crest of a rival foundry that had been declining for years. The man slipped away before she could question him. Hours later, after Pembroke offered Blackmere its largest contract in a generation, Clara returned home expecting to confront her husband's wounded pride. Instead, she found a coal delivery ledger waiting on her workshop table. No note accompanied it. She opened the book and examined the most recent entries. Every shipment needed to fulfill Pembroke's order had arrived 3 days late. The delays were too consistent to be accidental, and beside each altered date, someone had drawn a tiny black hammer, the same emblem she had seen hanging from the freight agent's chain. Clara turned the page and felt triumph drain from her chest. Blackmere had enough coal remaining for only 19 days. Someone had begun sabotaging the estate before Lord Pembroke ever offered them the contract, and whoever had left the ledger in her workshop wanted Clara to discover it before it was too late. Clara was still studying the marked delivery dates when the workshop door opened behind her. Adrian entered without knocking. He had removed his formal coat, but his expression retained all the stiffness he had carried home from Stonebridge. His gaze moved from the coal ledger to the miniature regulator resting on the workbench, then finally to his wife. "Lord Pembroke's solicitor has sent the preliminary agreement," he said. "He wants both signatures before noon tomorrow. We may not be able to fulfill it." Adrian stopped. Clara turned the ledger toward him and tapped the final column. 6 shipments have arrived late. Not 1 or 2 because of rain or damaged wagons. Every shipment has been delayed by precisely 3 days. The northern roads are unreliable. The roads did not draw this beside each altered entry. She showed him the tiny black hammer. Adrian's expression sharpened. "That is Lord Harcourt's forge mark. I saw the same emblem on a freight agent at the exhibition. He disappeared after you assured Lord Pembroke that our coal supply was secure. Harcourt has been bidding against Blackmere for years. That does not prove he interfered with our deliveries." "No, but this does." Clara turned to the inventory page. "The ledger claims that 80 tons arrived last Thursday. The storage figures show only 52. Either 28 tons vanished after reaching Blackmere, or someone changed the delivery entry to conceal a diversion." Adrian examined the figures. Pride urged him to reject her conclusion, but the arithmetic left him nowhere to hide. "Who gave you this book?" "I do not know. It was waiting here when I returned. Then it may have been planted." "To accomplish what?" "To push us into accusing a respected nobleman without proof." Clara closed the ledger. "You believe someone forged weeks of entries, infiltrated my workshop, and left evidence against Harcourt merely to embarrass us. I believe accepting an unexplained ledger as truth would be reckless, but accepting Lord Pembroke's contract while ignoring it would not." The question struck its mark. Adrian looked toward the darkened windows, beyond which the glow of Blackmere's furnaces pulsed against the night. "If the supply is truly that low, how long do we have?" 19 days at ordinary production. Under Pembroke's schedule, perhaps 12. The number stripped the last of the resistance from his face. Blackmere had survived years of dwindling orders by reducing wages, closing 2 workshops, and selling timber from its western lands. Pembroke's contract promised recovery, but failure on the first delivery would leave the estate more deeply indebted than before. They would purchase materials, hire additional workers, and expand production, only to discover that the furnaces had no fuel. "Come with me," Adrian said. "Where?" "To the records room. If the figures were altered here, the original invoices may tell us where." It was the first time he had invited her into the estate's commercial archive. The records room occupied a locked chamber beside his study. Clara had passed its door hundreds of times, knowing the estate's contracts lay inside, while being denied any formal right to inspect them. Adrian unlocked it now and lit 2 lamps. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling, crowded with shipping manifests, banking records, mine agreements, and correspondence accumulated across 3 generations. Clara removed her gloves and began searching the latest depot invoices, while Adrian examined the broker's contracts. They worked for nearly an hour before she found the first contradiction. "Here." Adrian came around the table. Clara placed 2 documents side by side. The depot ledger reported 80 tons delivered on Thursday. The mine invoice showed the same amount dispatched 3 days earlier. Yet the canal toll record listed a barge carrying only 52 tons under Blackmere's account. 28 tons disappeared between the northern pit and our depot, she said, or the toll clerk recorded the weight incorrectly. Then he made the identical mistake 4 times. She produced 3 more records. Each showed a full shipment leaving the mine and a lighter cargo passing through Westmere Lock. The missing coal varied slightly, but every diverted load amounted to nearly 1/3 of the shipment. Adrian's hand tightened against the table. "Who controls the barges?" "A transport broker named Silas Crowell. According to these papers, your father appointed him 15 years ago. I know Crowell. He has served Blackmere faithfully since before I inherited the title. Faithful men do not become incapable of betrayal simply because we prefer remembering their loyalty." His eyes lifted to hers. "Is that meant to concern Crowell?" Or me? Clara held his gaze. Whichever man requires the warning. For several seconds, neither spoke. The insult Adrian had delivered in the courtyard still stood between them, sharpened now by the public success he had tried to prevent. He might have apologized. Clara saw the possibility cross his face, but a knock sounded before he could speak. The butler entered with an envelope. This arrived by hand for her grace. There was no seal and no sender's name. Inside was a single sheet bearing 6 words. Ask what passed through Westmere at midnight. Adrian took the message from her. You are not going there. I did not ask your permission. Someone entered your workshop, left a confidential ledger, and now directs you toward an isolated canal lock after dark. You cannot possibly believe that is safe. No. I believe it is necessary. Then I will send men. If Crowell is involved, he will hear about a formal inspection before your riders leave the estate. And your solution is to approach the lock alone. My solution is to observe it without announcing that Blackmere has discovered the missing coal. Adrian folded the note once. We will inspect the depot tomorrow. By tomorrow, whoever sent this may be gone. Clara, a duchess inspecting ledgers embarrasses you, but a duchess exposing theft suddenly requires your protection. His expression changed. The words had cut through his authority and reached the shame beneath it. What happened at Stonebridge was not what I expected, he said, because you expected me to fail. I expected Pembroke to judge our household by its discipline. He judged it by its usefulness, and he found you more useful than me. At last, the truth stood openly between them. Clara's anger softened, but not enough to excuse him. That was not my intention. I know. Adrian looked down at the anonymous message. That may be what made it so difficult to bear. For the first time, she understood that his cruelty in the courtyard had come not merely from convention, but from fear. Blackmere had been entrusted to him, and he measured his worth by his ability to command it. Her competence had exposed how much of the estate he did not understand. Yet fear did not make his choice harmless. You had one moment to stand beside me, she said. You chose to let me face that room alone. Adrian absorbed the accusation, without defending himself. You are right. The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was the first apology he had offered her. Clara picked up her gloves. I am going to Westmere. Then I am coming with you. She studied him, searching for another command hidden beneath the words. You will follow my instructions if we find machinery involved. One corner of his mouth moved faintly. After today, I would be a fool not to. They left Blackmere shortly before 11, dressed in dark coats and riding separate horses. Westmere Lock lay 5 miles north of the estate, where the canal narrowed between 2 wooded embankments. They tethered their horses behind an abandoned toll cottage and approached the water on foot. For half an hour, nothing moved. Then a covered barge appeared around the bend without a lantern. Clara crouched behind the lockkeeper's shed. Adrian lowered himself beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers. Neither acknowledged it. The barge entered the lock and stopped. 2 men emerged from beneath its canvas covering. A cart waited on the opposite bank, and on its side, barely visible beneath fresh black paint, Clara saw the outline of crossed hammers. Harcourt's crest. The men began transferring coal into the cart. There is our missing tonnage, she whispered. Adrian shifted as if preparing to rise, but Clara caught his wrist. Not yet. We need the barge records and the men who ordered this. A metallic groan rolled across the canal. Clara turned toward the lock mechanism. One of its retaining bolts had worked halfway out of the housing. With every movement of the water, the iron gear pulled farther from its frame. That winch has been tampered with. The nearest worker heard her voice and spun around. His shout startled the others. One dropped his shovel against the lock lever. The weakened mechanism snapped. The upper gate lurched violently, releasing a wall of water into the narrow chamber. The barge struck the stonework, throwing one man into the canal, while the other clung desperately to the railing. The heavy iron gate began swinging toward them. Adrian seized Clara's arm. We must get back. If that gate closes, it will crush the barge and the man in the water. Before Adrian could stop her, Clara ran from their hiding place and leapt onto the wet stone platform beside the failing winch. The saboteurs fled toward the trees, abandoning their companion. Clara dropped beside the mechanism and saw the full extent of the damage. 2 retaining bolts had been loosened deliberately, while the emergency chain had been cut almost completely through. The gate had not merely failed. Someone had prepared it to collapse the moment a heavily loaded Blackmere barge entered the lock, and Clara was now kneeling directly above the mechanism as its final bolt began sliding free. "Adrian, the counterweight," Clara shouted. "Release it slowly if it falls at once. The gate will strike the barge." Adrian did not question her. He ran to the opposite side of the platform and seized the rusted control lever with both hands. The metal resisted him, locked in place by years of grime and the violent pressure of the water below. Clara pulled a narrow wrench from the inner pocket of her coat and forced it beneath the sliding bolt. The entire housing shuddered beneath her knees. One wrong movement would send the bolt free, release the gear, and allow several tons of iron to swing across the lock chamber. "Now," she called. Adrian threw his weight against the lever. It moved less than an inch, but that was enough to ease the strain pressing against Clara's wrench. She drove the bolt back into its housing, then tore the leather belt from her waist and wound it tightly around the damaged joint. It would not hold for long, but it might give them the seconds they needed. "Keep the pressure steady," she said. "Do not pull any farther until I reach the lower break. The platform is flooding. I can see that. Clara, the man in the water. Get him out. I will hold the gate." Adrian hesitated only long enough to understand that arguing would cost them both time. He released one hand from the lever, caught a mooring rope, and threw it toward the worker struggling in the current. The first throw fell short. The second landed across the man's shoulder. He seized it desperately, and Adrian dragged him toward the stone steps, while maintaining as much pressure on the lever as he could with his other arm. Clara crawled along the edge of the platform toward the lower brake wheel. Cold canal water surged over her boots, and the damaged mechanism groaned beneath her. Her improvised leather binding had begun to stretch. She reached the wheel, braced both feet against the stone, and turned. Nothing happened. The wheel had been jammed deliberately with a short iron spike, hammered between its teeth. She struck it with the wrench once, twice, then a third time. The spike fell away, and the emergency brake descended into the gear assembly with a deafening metallic crash. The gate stopped less than 3 feet from the barge. For several moments, the only sounds were rushing water and the rescued worker coughing on the bank. Clara remained crouched beside the brake wheel, breathing hard, unable to trust that the danger had truly passed. Then Adrian reached her, took her by the arms, and pulled her away from the mechanism just as the leather belt snapped. The bolt shot from its housing and struck the wall where her head had been seconds earlier. Adrian turned his body over hers as fragments of rusted iron scattered across the platform. When the noise subsided, Clara became aware of his heart pounding against her shoulder and his hand cradling the back of her head. "You might have been killed," he said, his voice raw. "So might the man in the water. That does not make your life less valuable." The words silenced her. Adrian released her slowly, as though only then realizing how tightly he had been holding her. The distance that had defined their marriage returned, but it no longer felt as secure as it had before. Clara rose and looked toward the trees. The other men had escaped, yet the cart remained where they had abandoned it. Beneath its covering were sacks marked with Blackmere's seal. Adrian opened one and ran the coal through his fingers. "This is ours." "And the lock was designed to fail while it was being stolen," Clara said. She pointed to the cut emergency chain and loosened bolts. If the gate had crushed the barge, everyone would have blamed worn machinery and an overloaded Blackmere shipment. Harcourt would gain our coal and destroy our delivery route in the same night. Adrian looked toward the rescued worker, who had recovered enough to sit upright. "Then we finally have someone who can tell us who ordered it." The man's name was Thomas Bell, a canal labourer with a wife and 2 young sons in Westmere village. Fear made him deny everything at first, but the evidence surrounding him left little room for invention. Adrian could have threatened him with prison. Instead, at Clara's urging, he promised protection for Bell's family if the man told the truth before Harcourt discovered he had survived. Bell finally admitted that Silas Crowell had paid him and the other labourers to divert portions of Blackmere's coal. The stolen fuel was delivered to Lord Harcourt's forge under altered transport papers. Yet Bell insisted that the broken lock had not been part of their agreement. "Mr. Crowell said the gate would stick long enough to delay your barges," he explained. "He never said it would break. When we saw the bolts coming loose, the others ran, because they thought we had been betrayed as well." "Who ordered Crowell to do this?" Clara asked. Belle glanced toward the crossed hammers painted on the cart. I never met the gentleman, but Crowell keeps every payment order in a red account book at his canal office. He says, a man who trusts another man's memory deserves to be cheated. By dawn, Adrian had sent 2 loyal estate guards to protect Belle's cottage and secure the abandoned cart. He and Clara rode back to Blackmere in exhausted silence. Her coat was soaked, her gloves torn, and a bruise had begun forming along her wrist where Adrian had pulled her from the mechanism. At the stable doors, he dismounted first and came to help her down. Clara could have managed without him, but she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with unusual care. You believed me tonight, she said. I should have believed you yesterday. That is not the same thing. No, he looked at the soot and canal mud staining her clothes. But I am beginning to understand how much my refusal cost us. She expected another careful excuse. Instead, he bowed his head. I was afraid that if Pembroke saw your ability, he would recognize how little I had contributed beside you. So I tried to make you smaller. That was cowardly, Clara, and it was cruel. The apology did not erase the courtyard or the 17 months preceding it, but it gave the wound a name. For now, that was enough. Do not apologize by praising me in private, she said. You diminished me before witnesses. Repair it before witnesses. Adrian met her eyes. I will. They had barely entered the house when the butler announced that the trustees were waiting in the drawing room. News of the midnight disturbance had already travelled from Westmere, though someone had altered the story before it reached Blackmere. According to the message delivered to the board, Clara had trespassed at the canal, damaged a public lock, endangered a commercial barge, and falsely seized coal belonging to Lord Harcourt. The accusation had been signed by Silas Crowell. 6 trustees waited around the long mahogany table. At their centre sat Mr. Ashford, the eldest and most conservative of them, holding Crowell's complaint as though it were a judicial verdict. Clara entered in her soaked riding clothes, and his expression tightened with open disapproval. Your Grace, he said to Adrian, deliberately refusing to address her. This cannot continue. Yesterday, the Duchess disrupted a public exhibition. Tonight she interfered with lawful trade and caused serious damage to county property. Lord Harcourt is already threatening legal action. The lock was sabotaged, Clara said. The coal aboard that barge carried Blackmere's seal. Ashford's gaze remained fixed on Adrian. This is precisely the difficulty. Her Grace mistakes personal conviction for authority. Whatever mechanical interests she possesses, she cannot be permitted to expose this estate to scandal whenever suspicion takes hold of her. Adrian walked to the head of the table. Clara watched him, uncertain whether his apology would survive its first public test. He picked up Crowell's complaint, read the accusation in silence, and tore it cleanly in half. Every trustee stared at him. My wife did not endanger that barge, Adrian said. She saved it. She also saved the life of one of Crowell's labourers and prevented a deliberately weakened lock from destroying Blackmere's principal trade route. The coal was ours, the shipping records were altered, and a surviving witness has agreed to testify. Ashford rose abruptly. You would place the standing of this estate in the hands of a canal thief and a woman who arrived at an industrial exhibition dressed as a labourer. Adrian's face hardened. No, I am placing it in the hands of the person who secured our contract, uncovered the missing fuel, identified the false records, and repaired a mechanism while the rest of us were still deciding whether she belonged in the room. He turned toward Clara before the entire board. From this morning forward, the Duchess will hold equal authority over Blackmere's foundry operations and supply contracts. Any report concerning production, transport, or machinery will be delivered to her, as well as to me. Any man who refuses may surrender his position. The declaration sent a murmur around the table. Clara felt no triumph, only the unexpected weight of finally receiving what should never have required danger to earn. Ashford sat down slowly, his opposition contained but not defeated. Adrian placed the recovered delivery ledger beside Crowell's torn complaint. We will present the evidence to the Stonebridge Trade Council in 3 days. Until then, nothing leaves this room. A young trustee near the end of the table cleared his throat. Your Grace, if Crowell truly keeps a red account book, Harcourt will destroy it the moment. Clara looked toward Adrian. They both understood the same thing at once. The meeting itself had been the trap. Only 7 people had known about Belle's survival when they entered the room, yet outside the windows, a rider bearing the crossed hammer crest was already racing away from Blackmere towards Silas Crowell's canal office. Adrian reached the window first. The rider was already beyond the lower gates, bent low over his horse as he took the road toward Westmere. "Seal the house," Adrian ordered. "No trustee leaves until we discover who sent that warning." Ashford pushed back his chair with an expression of outrage. "You cannot detain gentlemen of this board on the strength of your wife's suspicions." "The rider departed less than a minute after we mentioned Crowell's account book," Clara said. "Someone in this room brought him to Blackmere, or arranged for him to wait nearby. And you intend to accuse all of us?" "No, only the one who appears more frightened by a locked door than by the theft of our coal." The younger trustee moved away from the table, but the others remained seated. Adrian called 2 footmen and instructed them to secure every entrance. Then he turned to Clara. "How long would a rider need to reach Crowell's office?" 40 minutes if he stays on the road, less if he cuts across the western fields. "We cannot catch him on tired horses." "We do not need to catch him. We need to reach the office first." She crossed to the large estate map hanging beside the fireplace and traced the canal with one finger. Crowell's office stood on the southern bank, close to Westmere village. The rider had chosen the main road, but a disused railway cutting ran from Blackmere's eastern works directly toward the canal. It had once carried iron carts downhill to the wharf before part of the track collapsed. The route was too rough for a carriage and too narrow for horses, but the maintenance trolley remained inside the old loading shed. "The gradient will carry us most of the way," Clara said, "if its brake still works." Adrian looked at the rain-darkened window and then back at her. "When did anyone last inspect it?" 8 years ago, according to your maintenance records. That is not reassuring. Neither is allowing Crowell to burn the only account linking Harcourt to the stolen shipments. They left the trustees under guard and hurried to the eastern works. The trolley stood beneath years of dust, a narrow iron platform mounted on 4 wheels, with a handbrake and a lever-operated pump for climbing shallow sections of track. Clara checked the axle pins while Adrian cleared debris from the rails. It was an absurd vehicle for a Duke and Duchess, but dignity had already cost Blackmere enough. Minutes later, they pushed it out of the shed and climbed aboard. The track descended sharply beyond the yard. Clara released the brake, and the trolley began rolling through the cutting, gathering speed until the estate walls disappeared behind them. Wind tore at her loosened hair. Adrian stood beside her, with one hand on the brake housing, and the other braced around her waist whenever the wheels struck an uneven joint. Neither commented on the closeness. Ahead, the old rails curved between steep banks, overgrown with brambles. "There should be a bridge beyond the next turn," Clara called. "Should be?" It was present on the 8-year-old map. "Your talent for reassurance remains remarkable." They rounded the curve and saw that half the bridge railing had collapsed, but the track itself remained intact. Clara applied the brake. The lever shuddered violently, slowing them only slightly. "The brake lining is worn." "Can we stop?" Eventually. 2000. Before the canal? That depends on whether the lower buffer is still there." Adrian stared ahead. "I begin to understand why no one uses this route." He dropped to one knee and examined the brake chain. At Clara's direction, he tightened it around the wheel housing while she held the lever steady. The trolley crossed the bridge with its iron wheels screaming against the rails, then slowed as the land leveled near Westmere. They jumped off before reaching the broken end of the line and ran the remaining distance to Crowell's office. Smoke was already rising from its chimney. The front door had been locked from inside. Adrian struck it with his shoulder, once and then again, splintering the frame. They entered a narrow room filled with shipping documents and the bitter smell of burning paper. Silas Crowell stood beside the fireplace, feeding pages into the flames. He was a thick-set man, nearing 60, dressed in an expensive coat that sat poorly on his labourer's shoulders. The red account book lay open on the desk behind him. "Your Graces," he said, recovering from his surprise. "This is an unexpected intrusion." Clara moved toward the desk, but Crowell drew a pistol from beneath his coat. Adrian stepped between them. "Put it down. I cannot do that." Crowell's hand trembled, though the barrel remained pointed at Adrian's chest. "Lord Harcourt promised that no one would be harmed." Blackmere was meant to miss its first shipment, lose Pembroke's contract, and return to producing the ordinary ironwork it was suited for. Then the Duchess appeared with her machine and began opening books no woman had ever troubled to read. "You cut the lock chain," Clara said. "I ordered it weakened, not destroyed. Harcourt wanted the canal closed long enough to delay your deliveries. Your midnight interference turned a manageable plan into chaos. A man nearly drowned because he panicked. And now you are burning the proof." Crowell glanced toward the red ledger. That moment of distraction was enough. Adrian lunged, striking the pistol aside as it fired. The shot tore through a shelf, showering the room with paper and splintered wood. Crowell stumbled into the desk, and Clara seized the account book. A burning sheet fell from the fireplace onto the rug. Flames raced across its dry fibers toward the stacks of documents along the wall. "Get outside," Adrian shouted. Clara tucked the ledger beneath her coat and grabbed the nearest bundle of transport orders. Adrian forced Crowell through the broken doorway as smoke filled the room. They had barely reached the towpath when the office windows shattered behind them. Crowell collapsed on the wet ground, coughing. Adrian took the pistol and searched him for another weapon. Clara opened the red ledger beneath the shelter of a warehouse awning. Many pages had been torn out, but the surviving entries showed payments from a company called Vale, agricultural supply to Crowell, the canal workers, and 2 Blackmere depot clerks. Every payment had been made shortly before a shipment disappeared. Yet Lord Harcourt's name did not appear anywhere. "He used a false company," Adrian said. "The council will say anyone could control it." "Not anyone." Clara examined the inked emblem stamped beside each payment. It depicted a wheat sheaf within a circular border. "This company claims to sell agricultural equipment, but the stamp was made with an iron die. Look at the lower curve. There is a fracture in the border." Adrian saw no significance in it until Clara removed one of the scorched transport orders she had saved from the office. The same emblem appeared beneath Crowell's signature, but on that document, the impression was deeper on the right side. "The die was mounted in a lever press," she explained. "The pressure falls unevenly because its hinge is worn. If we find the press, we find the place these orders were created." Crowell laughed hoarsely. "You will find dozens of old presses in this county, but only one with that exact fracture and worn hinge. You cannot prove it belongs to Harcourt." "Perhaps not yet." Clara turned another page. Near the back of the ledger, she found a payment to someone, identified only by the initials E.A. The date was 2 days before Lord Pembroke's visit to Stonebridge. Beside it were 4 words: "Blackmere schedule" and "household access." Adrian read the line twice. His expression became dangerously still. Someone inside our house gave them the delivery schedule before the contract was announced. Clara looked back toward the distant estate, and that person was sitting in the drawing room when we left. By the time they returned to Blackmere, the trustees had been confined for nearly 3 hours. One chair was empty. Mr. Ashford stood near the fireplace, furious at the continued detention, while the younger men whispered among themselves. Adrian counted them once, then faced the guards. "Where is Mr. Ellison?" One footman went pale. He complained of chest pain. "Your Grace, Mr. Ashford ordered us to let him rest in the library." They searched the library and found its window open. A length of curtain had been tied to the balcony rail, reaching down toward the garden. Ellison was gone. On the carpet beneath the window lay a small lump of black sealing wax stamped with crossed hammers. Adrian closed his fist around it. "Ellison has managed our freight payments for 12 years, and his initials are E.A., Clara said. Ashford entered behind them and stopped when he saw the open window. For the first time, certainty deserted his face. "That proves only that the man fled. It proves he had reason to fear what we found," Adrian replied. Clara searched Ellison's abandoned desk. The drawers had been emptied, but a torn payment receipt remained trapped beneath the inkstand. It carried the name Vale Agricultural Supply and the same broken seal found on the forged orders. Adrian read the initials beside the payment. E.A. "Edmund Ellison," Clara said. The truth was finally simple enough to name. Ellison had used his position inside Blackmere to steal schedules, copy Adrian's signature, and create the false company that financed Harcourt's sabotage. Adrian stared at the receipt. "I gave him access to every record he needed. You trusted the wrong man and refused to trust the right woman. Before Clara could answer, the foundry's emergency bell began ringing. A bell began ringing from the direction of the eastern works. One strike, followed by 2 rapid blows. Then another, a foundry emergency signal. Adrian crossed to the window. Workers were running through the yard toward the great furnace, where an unnatural column of black smoke had begun rising above the roof. Clara felt the meaning settle over her before anyone spoke. Ellison had fled because the account book was no longer Harcourt's final defense. The sabotage at the canal had failed, but someone had already prepared another way to destroy Blackmere's contract. And this time, the attack had begun inside the foundry itself. Clara reached the eastern works before the second alarm finished ringing. Black smoke poured through the roof vents, and workers crowded the yard while the foundry master shouted contradictory orders from the doorway. Inside, the great furnace burned with an uneven orange glare. Its iron casing trembled, and each vibration sent a deep groan through the floor. "How long has the pressure been rising?" Clara demanded. 10 minutes, perhaps 15, the foundry master answered. "The main exhaust valve will not open. Why is the furnace operating at full capacity? Production was not scheduled to increase until tomorrow." The man stared at her. Mr. Ellison brought the Duke's written authorization before dawn. Adrian arrived behind her and seized the document. His signature appeared at the bottom, but Clara saw at once that the command had been copied from an older production order. Ellison had started the furnace early, while its most experienced engineers were still at home, and he had done so under Adrian's stolen authority. A violent bang echoed from within the casing. Several workers backed toward the doors. Clara moved closer instead. The pressure gauge had climbed beyond the red warning line, yet the fire beneath the chamber continued receiving coal. "Shut the intake gate," she ordered. "We tried," the foundry master said. "The control chain is jammed." "Then clear the building." Adrian stepped beside her. "You heard her. Everyone outside." The workers obeyed, but Clara remained near the furnace, studying the mechanism. The main exhaust valve should have opened automatically under such pressure. If both the intake and exhaust had failed at the same time, the damage was not accidental. Someone had transformed the furnace into a sealed iron vessel and filled it with heat. "Clara, move," Adrian said. "Not yet. If we abandon it now, the casing will rupture before the fire dies. The eastern works will be destroyed. The building can be rebuilt. Not if the explosion reaches the coal store." Adrian looked toward the adjoining wall, beyond which enough fuel had been stacked to burn for days. "Tell me what you need." Clara climbed onto the maintenance platform and opened the exhaust housing. The valve wheel had been fixed in place, with a hardened steel pin driven through the joint. She struck it with her wrench, but it did not shift. "The pin must be cut," the foundry master called from the doorway. "The cutting tools are in the lower workshop." "There is no time." Clara looked toward the regulator from her exhibition model, now mounted temporarily beside the furnace for testing. The small brass mechanism could not control a chamber this large, but its pressure line might create a second route for the trapped steam. Her father's notebooks had described such an emergency conversion, though he had never tested it at full scale. She crossed to the regulator and began loosening its copper feed pipe. Adrian followed. "What are you doing?" "Giving the pressure another way out. That pipe is no wider than my thumb. It does not need to empty the chamber. It only needs to reduce the strain long enough for us to cut the pin." Another groan rolled through the furnace. A seam along its upper casing began to glow. Clara pulled off her coat and wrapped it around her hands before taking hold of the heated coupling. Adrian removed his own gloves and reached for the opposite side. "Do not touch it," she warned. "The metal will burn through the leather. Then explain how you intend to move it alone." She had no answer. Together, they turned the coupling until the pipe came free with a burst of steam. Clara connected it to the emergency inspection port, while Adrian held the line steady. The heat scorched his sleeve and blistered the skin beneath his glove, but he did not release it. "Open the regulator when I say," Clara told him. "Slowly. If you turn it too quickly, the line may tear free." She climbed back to the exhaust housing and wedged her wrench beneath the steel pin. "Now." Adrian opened the brass valve. Steam screamed through the narrow pipe, filling the foundry with a white cloud. The gauge needle dropped by a fraction. Clara forced the wrench upward. The pin shifted, but did not come free. She struck it again. The furnace casing shuddered so violently that she lost her footing. Adrian released the valve long enough to catch her before she fell from the platform. "I have you," he said. The words were simple, but Clara heard everything that had been absent in the courtyard. She regained her balance and drove the wrench against the pin with both hands. It snapped. The main exhaust wheel spun open, releasing a towering column of steam through the roof vent. The pressure gauge fell steadily out of the red, and the terrible groaning inside the casing softened into the ordinary thunder of a working furnace. Only when the needle reached a safe level did Clara allow herself to breathe. Adrian remained below the platform, one hand still raised as if prepared to catch her again. His right sleeve had burned through near the wrist. She descended quickly and took his hand. Angry blisters marked his palm. "You should have let go. You would have been standing beside that furnace when the line tore loose. That does not make your hand expendable." A tired smile touched his face. "Then we agree on something." Outside, the workers erupted into relieved conversation. When the black smoke thinned, Clara ordered the furnace closed until every valve and chain could be inspected. The production delay would cost them at least 2 days, but the works remained standing, and no one had been killed. Their relief lasted only until a carriage bearing Lord Pembroke's crest entered the yard. The investor stepped down with his solicitor beside him, both men staring at the smoke. "I received a message claiming Blackmere's new regulator had caused a furnace failure," Pembroke said. Clara's stomach tightened. The regulator prevented the failure. The main valve was deliberately pinned shut. Then someone has misrepresented the incident. The solicitor produced a folded letter. It bore Clara's name and an imitation of her signature. According to the message, she had ordered the furnace activated early to demonstrate her invention at full scale. It also stated that Adrian had opposed the test but had been overruled after granting her operational authority. Pembroke read the accusation without expression. "If this account is true, Duchess, you risked the foundry and every worker inside it to prove your design. It is false. The letter was delivered to my residence 2 hours before the emergency bell rang. Then it was prepared before the sabotage began," Clara said. "That timing proves planning, not guilt." Pembroke looked toward the scorched furnace doors. "Perhaps, but my partners in Bristol will not release further funds while Blackmere's safety and leadership remain in question. Until the Trade Council determines what happened, I must suspend the contract." The words silenced the entire yard. Without Pembroke's advance payment, Blackmere could not purchase replacement coal or repair the damaged furnace. The workers who had just watched Clara save their lives now faced dismissal because someone had placed her name on the order that endangered them. Adrian stepped forward. "The responsibility is mine." Clara turned sharply toward him. "No. The forged authorization bears my signature, and Ellison had access because I entrusted him with the estate's freight accounts. I also kept my wife outside Blackmere's commercial decisions for 17 months, leaving her without the formal authority that might have exposed these irregularities earlier. If Pembroke requires one name to answer for this failure, he will use mine." His declaration traveled through the gathered workers in a low murmur. Pembroke studied him carefully. "You understand that such an admission may cost you control of this contract, even if it is restored?" "Yes. And possibly your position before the trustees?" "Yes." Adrian did not look away. "My wife warned me that our coal supply was compromised. I dismissed the possibility because accepting her judgment wounded my pride. Everything Harcourt and Ellison accomplished afterward was made easier by that choice. I will not save my reputation by allowing them to destroy hers." It was the public repair Clara had demanded, offered when it cost him most. Yet before Pembroke could respond, one of the estate guards rode into the yard with blood on his collar. He had been sent to protect Thomas Bell. "The witness is gone," he reported breathlessly. 3 men attacked the cottage. They took Bell and left this nailed to the door. He handed Adrian a notice, bearing the authority of the Stonebridge magistrate. It accused Clara of damaging Westmere Lock, stealing Lord Harcourt's coal, falsifying Blackmere's production orders, and recklessly causing the furnace emergency. An order had been issued for her appearance before the Trade Council the following morning. If she failed to prove her claims, Pembroke's contract would be awarded to Harcourt's forge, and the cost of repairing the canal would be charged against her marriage settlement. Clara examined the magistrate's seal and saw the same uneven pressure mark that appeared on the false agricultural documents. The order had been produced on Harcourt's damaged press. That could expose the entire scheme if she could place the press before the council. But Ellison had escaped. Belle had been abducted, and the only surviving witness who could identify the machine was Silas Crowell. Clara turned toward the guards holding him near the stable wall. Crowell's hands were empty. The chain around his wrists lay open on the ground, and beyond the rear gates, a rider in a dark coat was disappearing into the woods. Adrian sent riders toward the woods, but Clara knew Crowell had not escaped by chance. Someone had opened his restraints while every eye was fixed on the burning furnace, and whoever arranged it had chosen the exact moment when pursuit would be impossible. The workers needed direction. Pembroke required an answer, and the council hearing was less than a day away. "Let him run," she said. Adrian stared at her. "He is the only man who can identify Harcourt's press. Then he will go to the one place where he believes Harcourt can protect him." She looked toward the crossed hammer emblem, still visible on the abandoned coal cart. "We do not need to search the county. We need to watch Harcourt's forge." Pembroke agreed to delay his departure until the hearing, but he refused to restore the contract without proof. The damaged furnace was shut down, and the workers began the slow task of examining every valve, chain, and fuel line. Clara personally removed the steel pin from the exhaust housing and placed it inside a locked evidence chest with the forged production order, the red ledger, the magistrate's notice, and the fragment of black sealing wax found beneath Ellison's window. Each item proved a piece of the scheme, but none alone could establish that Harcourt commanded it. Their strongest witness had vanished, their second had been abducted, and Ellison carried knowledge of Blackmere's internal operations that could be turned against them before the council. Clara spent the afternoon in her father's abandoned workshop, comparing every stamp and seal beneath a magnifying lens. Adrian found her there after sunset, still wearing her soot-marked clothes, surrounded by papers. His injured hand had been bandaged, though the white linen was already stained where the burns had begun to seep. "You should rest," he said. "So should you. I am not the one expected to defend myself before the council tomorrow. No, you are merely the man who publicly accepted responsibility for everything." She looked at his bandage. "Sit down." Adrian obeyed without argument. Clara unwrapped his hand and replaced the salve the house physician had applied too hastily. His fingers tightened once when she touched the worst burn, but he made no sound. "You used to refuse to enter this workshop," she said. "I thought encouraging you would make your interests more visible, and that frightened you." "Yes." The honesty of the answer surprised her more than denial would have. Adrian watched her wind fresh linen around his palm. "My father believed authority could survive only if it was never questioned. When he died, I inherited an estate already losing money, 6 trustees waiting for me to fail, and hundreds of families whose livelihoods depended on decisions I had never been taught to make. I mistook certainty for competence because I feared admitting how much I did not know. So, when I knew something you did not, you treated it as a threat. I treated you as a threat." Clara finished tying the bandage and released his hand. "That is harder to forgive." "I know." Adrian's voice dropped. "I am not asking you to forgive it tonight. I am asking for the chance to become a man who would deserve it someday." The space between them grew still. Until that moment, every improvement in their marriage had been driven by danger. An exhibition, a collapsing lock, a burning furnace. Now nothing forced Adrian to remain beside her. Nothing compelled Clara to reach across the table and touch the edge of his bandage once more. Yet neither moved away. "I wanted you to see me long before Stonebridge," she admitted. "Every time I carried one of my father's notebooks through this house, I hoped you would ask what I was building. I told myself I did not care, but I did." Pain crossed his face. "Why did you stop hoping? The night I showed you my first valve drawing, you glanced at it and said the blue ink would stain the dining table." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, remembering. "Clara, do not repair it with another apology. Help me win tomorrow." 19:5. 19:5. 19:5. He nodded. "Tell me how." Clara placed the forged notice beside the false agricultural order. Both seals carried the same broken curve. "One damaged press made them," she said. Adrian leaned closer. "Can you prove where it is?" "If we find the press, yes. But Ellison knows I recognized its mark. He will destroy it before morning. Then we reach it tonight." Clara looked at his bandaged hand. You have already been burned once because of this, and I have already stood aside once when you needed me, Adrian replied. I will not repeat that mistake. If the press remains at Harcourt's forge, it will not. Ellison knows I recognized its lubricant. He will move or destroy it before morning. Adrian studied the marks. Then we must reach it tonight. They did not approach Harcourt's estate with guards or a formal warrant. Any visible force would warn the men inside. Instead, Clara and Adrian rode to a hill overlooking the forge, leaving 2 trusted workers at a distance with instructions to summon the magistrate only if they saw a red lantern raised from the eastern window. Below them, Harcourt's works appeared nearly abandoned. 1 furnace burned weakly, and only a handful of labourers crossed the yard. The once prosperous buildings had fallen into decay, their roofs patched, and their stone walls darkened by years of neglect. Clara understood then why Harcourt had become desperate. Pembroke's contract would not merely have made Blackmere wealthy, it represented Harcourt's final opportunity to keep his ancestral works alive. A cart stood near the rear warehouse. Crowell's horse was tethered beside it. He came exactly where you predicted, Adrian whispered. They descended the hill on foot and entered through a broken section of wall. Voices drifted from the warehouse. Clara recognized Crowell first, pleading for money and a safe route out of the county. Ellison answered him with contempt. You were paid to destroy the account book, not deliver half of it into the Duchess's hands. A third voice followed, low and controlled. Lord Harcourt himself. The ledger no longer matters. By noon tomorrow, the council will have declared her reckless. Pembroke will sign with me, and Blackmere will bear the repair costs. Once that occurs, the Duke's trustees will remove her from the foundry themselves. Adrian's jaw tightened, but Clara touched his sleeve and signalled for silence. They needed proof, not merely words overheard in darkness. Through a crack in the warehouse door, she saw the iron press standing beside several crates. Its handle bore the same black oil found on Ellison's desk. Thomas Bell was tied to a chair near the wall, bruised but alive. Harcourt placed a fresh document beneath the press. This is Clara Ashbourne's confession, he said. It states that she falsified the coal records to force her husband into granting her authority. When the council sees her signature beside the original Blackmere seal, nothing she presents will matter. Ellison lowered the lever. The press descended unevenly, twisting at the final instant, exactly as Clara had predicted. She needed the document, the machine, and Bell. Securing all 3 without alerting the men seemed impossible until she noticed the belt running from the warehouse's small steam engine to the press table. The engine powered a cutting wheel used to trim forged seals. Its pressure valve was old, badly maintained, and positioned beside the outer wall. Clara leaned close to Adrian. When the engine releases steam, take Bell through the rear door. And you? I will take the confession. No, Adrian. We have one opportunity, then we use it together. Before she could argue, he removed the Blackmere signet ring from his finger and placed it in her hand. If we are separated, show this to the magistrate. It carries my authority, and I will swear publicly to every decision that brought us here. Clara closed her fingers around the ring. Do not let them capture you. A faint, almost rueful smile crossed his face. That is very nearly concerned, Duchess. It is an instruction. She moved along the outside wall until she reached the steam valve. With one sharp turn, she redirected the pressure into the engine's emergency whistle. A piercing shriek tore through the warehouse. The cutting wheel accelerated, snapped its worn belt, and sent it whipping across the room. Harcourt and Ellison ducked. Adrian burst through the rear door, overturned Bell's chair to pull him clear, and cut his bindings. Clara entered from the opposite side and seized the forged confession from beneath the raised press. Crowell saw her first. The Duchess. Ellison lunged across the table, catching the sleeve of her coat. Clara twisted away, but the forged paper tore between them. She retained only the lower half, bearing the false signature and seal. Harcourt grabbed a lantern and hurled it against the press. Oil spread across the wooden base, and flames climbed instantly toward the metal frame. If I cannot use it, he said, backing toward the door, neither can you prove where those papers were made. Clara looked at the burning press, and then at the heavy iron die still locked beneath its upper plate. The wooden structure might burn, but iron carried memory differently. Heat would not erase the fracture in the seal or the uneven wear in its hinge. She reached for the release lever. Behind her, a pistol clicked. Ellison stood between Clara and the door, aiming directly at her. "Step away from the press," he said, "or Blackmere will need a new Duchess before morning." Clara kept one hand on the press lever, and the other closed around Adrian's signet ring inside her coat. Flames climbed the wooden frame beside her, heating the iron die until smoke curled from the paper trapped beneath it. Ellison stood 10 feet away with the pistol aimed at her chest. Behind him, Adrian had freed Thomas Bell, but Lord Harcourt blocked the rear door, while Crowell remained frozen beside a stack of crates, caught between the men who had paid him and the woman who possessed his ledger. "You cannot shoot me without destroying Harcourt's final chance at the contract," Clara said. "Pembroke will never reward a man connected to the murder of a duchess." Ellison's mouth tightened. "The fire killed you while you trespassed. The Duke will be found beside your body, having followed you into another of your reckless adventures. And Bell? A canal thief, consumed by the same blaze." Thomas Bell went pale. Crowell looked toward the rapidly spreading fire and seemed to understand that Harcourt intended to leave no witness alive. "You said no one would be harmed," he said. Harcourt's expression hardened. "You have become expensive, Silas. Expensive men should know when silence is their only remaining value." Crowell moved before Ellison could turn. He shoved a crate into the accountant's knees. The pistol discharged into the roof, and Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides, striking Ellison's wrist until the weapon fell. Harcourt escaped through the rear door. Adrian could have followed him, but the burning rafters cracked overhead and a beam fell between them, sealing the exit in flame. "Clara, leave the press," he shouted. She pulled the release lever. The heated iron die dropped from its mounting onto the stone floor, its fractured edge glowing red. Clara wrapped it in a heavy canvas sheet and dragged it toward the front entrance. Crowell and Adrian supported Bell between them. Smoke swallowed the upper half of the room, and burning fragments rained from the ceiling. They reached the main door only to find it barred from outside. Harcourt had locked them in. Adrian threw his shoulder against it, but the heavy timber did not move. Clara looked toward the small steam engine. The broken drive belt lay across the floor, one end still wound around the turning flywheel. "Stand back." She hooked the loose belt around the door's inner brace, opened the engine valve, and forced the flywheel into motion. The belt tightened. For one terrible moment, the timber held, then the brace tore from the frame, carrying half the door with it. They stumbled into the yard as the warehouse roof collapsed behind them. A red lantern shone from the eastern window. The workers stationed on the hill had seen the fire and summoned the magistrate. His constables entered Harcourt's yard, minutes later, surrounding the forge before the remaining men could flee. Harcourt was found near the carriage house, attempting to leave, with 2 cases of money. Ellison was taken from the warehouse doorway with a broken wrist, while Crowell surrendered voluntarily and asked that his cooperation be recorded before Harcourt had another opportunity to silence him. The press itself was destroyed, but Clara had saved its iron die, the torn confession, and Thomas Bell. For the first time since the missing coal had been discovered, the scheme possessed a complete chain. The forged records, the machine that produced them, the workers who carried out the diversions, and the nobleman who had tried to burn every connection between them. The magistrate ordered Harcourt and Ellison held until the Trade Council hearing. Yet even then, Harcourt refused to admit defeat. "You have stolen machinery from my property," he told Clara as the constables secured his hands. "You invaded my warehouse and caused a fire. Whatever stories frightened labourers tell tomorrow, the council will see a desperate woman trying to save an invention that nearly destroyed her husband's furnace." Clara held up the fractured die. "Then you should have no objection when I ask the council to compare this with every false document bearing my name." For the first time, Harcourt looked afraid. They returned to Blackmere shortly before dawn. Thomas Bell was reunited with his wife and children under guard. Crowell was confined in the estate's stone office, watched by men Adrian trusted personally. Neither Clara nor Adrian had slept in nearly 2 days, but the council hearing would begin at 10. Servants brought hot water, food, and formal clothes to their adjoining chambers. Clara stood before the blue silk gown Adrian had ordered her to wear at the exhibition. Its silver-threaded skirts gleamed in the early light, untouched since the morning she rode away from him. A knock sounded at the connecting door. Adrian entered only after she granted permission. His coat had been scorched at one shoulder, soot shadowed his face, and his injured hand had begun bleeding through its bandage again. His gaze settled on the blue gown. "You do not have to wear that. The council expects